Good afternoon, everybody, or good evening, I should say. We're sort of in that in-between time, I guess. My name is Paul Edgar. I'm the Associate Director for the Clements Center for National Security here at the University of Texas. And let me begin by thanking our two partners, our two partner organizations. This conference is brought to you by three organizations, two here at the University of Texas, and one that is a little bit further afield. So the Clements Center, of course, the UT History Department, and the America and the World Consortium, which consists of four institutions across the United States. Thank you to our presenters. Almost all of you are here. We have a couple that will continue to straggle in, but thank you to you, our presenters. And proper introductions for each of you will follow, I promise. But just up front, thank you. A little bit on the origin of this conference. A few years ago, and I can't remember exactly when it was, we can probably do a little Google search and figure out when this occurred, but all of us began noting and maybe even using rhetorically this idea that we are in a new Cold War. Kind of about the same time we started using great power competition to define the moment or define the near future. The idea of a second Cold War appeared, again, I think rhetorically. And it would usually go something like, we're in a new Cold War with China, and things are the same except for our economies are entangled. Something along those lines. It was a little bit shallow. You knew there was something there, but it felt a little bit shallow. You had to think, isn't there more? And also, not only isn't there more, isn't it important that we get this analogy, or better yet, perhaps, a complicated assortment of analogies? Isn't it important that we get these things as right as possible if we are going to use them? And the Clements Center, like many in our professional and scholarly circles, we assert that the rigorous study of history is of great practical use. But that proposition is much easier to say than it is to do. It's easy to get things wrong. So the aim of this conference is to be a model of applied history that is useful, that gets many things right, and in the decades to come, as people reflect back, as perhaps we in this room reflect back, is respected and admired as something to be followed. But of course, then that comes with the challenge that doing good history by itself is incredibly difficult. Applying good history is difficulty squared. So thanks again for all of you in attendance, for those of you participating. Thank you for signing up for both the aim and the challenge of what it is that we're trying to do. One quick note, and throughout the next day and a half, I'll have a few administrative notes here and there. One of them, though, is that we are recording this. You see the camera and the lights. We're recording this not for public use, but for use by a potential publisher to determine whether this is something that's worthy to get out in book form in the fairly near future. So that's all I've got for opening remarks. I'd now like to introduce to you the Executive Director of the Clements Center, Vice Admiral Joseph McGuire, who presides over the planning and execution of these things, of this conference, he will welcome our preeminent keynote speaker. A quick word first, though, on Joe's career. Vice Admiral McGuire spent a career as a Navy SEAL, most of that time with SEAL Team 6 and our Joint Special Operations Command. He retired in 2010, but just like in the movies, he was recalled to active service in 2018 for one last big mission, but this time in the form of a civilian. He was the director of the National Center for Counterterrorism and later promoted to cabinet-level office as the acting director of national intelligence. So please welcome the Clements Center's Executive Director, Vice Admiral Joseph McGuire.
Thank you, Paul, and hello, everyone. I'd like to extend a warm welcome to everybody, our students, our staff, faculty, community members, panelists, and moderators. Thank you so much for being with us. I'd also like to welcome and recognize and name a few of our very distinguished practitioners. The Honorable Robert Zoellick, former president of the World Bank Group. The Honorable Elliot Cohen, former counselor of the Department of State. Ambassador Robert Hutchins, former chairman of the National Intelligence Council and former specialist advisor to the Secretary of State. Major General Jeannie Leavitt, former commander of the 4th and 75th Fighter Wings, and former principal assistant to the 2 Secretaries of Defense. And Dr. Michael Kimmage, formerly of the Department of State Policy Planning Staff. Special thanks to my friends and our conference planners, Dr. Mark Lawrence, chair of the University of Texas Department of History. Mark also holds the Walter Prescott Webb Chair in History, and Dr. Jeremy Surrey, chair of, who holds the Mac Brown Distinguished Chair of Leadership for Global Affairs. Mark and Jeremy are the primary planners for this conference. And for all of you who are here for this conference, you are here because they identified you as the foremost scholar and practitioners in your field. This conference is important to me on a very personal level. I am not an historian, and for those who know me well, I'm also not a scholar. But I grew up during the Cold War, and from the time that I put my uniform on for the first time in 1974 until the fall of the Soviet Union, I was very much involved in the Cold War, to include some of the proxy wars that we participated in. That experience shaped me as a person. I firmly believe that it's critically important today because although it was a dangerous world back then, I believe that the world is far more dangerous today, that we apply the lessons of the Cold War to our 21st century challenges. And to help us with that, I extend an extra special welcome to the most accomplished and distinguished historian of the Cold War, Dr. Mel Leffler, Emeritus Professor of American History at the University of Virginia. With a watchful eye, Dr. Leffler ensured that both Mark and Jeremy did not go astray while planning this event. It is difficult to summarize Mel's contributions to scholarship, or through his scholarship, the steady guidance that he provided to countless policymakers and practitioners over the past 50 years. There's nobody better in the field, and there's no one more appropriate. There's no more appropriate person to give our first keynote speech and to get it moving in the right direction. He has made significant contributions to the field of history, and much more importantly, to our nation. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Dr. Mel Leffler.
Thanks, Admiral, for that incredibly generous introduction. I feel very honored to kick off this conference, and I'm looking forward to hearing many superb contributions. I'll start by talking about a contribution made by 2 very noteworthy scholars many years ago. Ernie May and Dick Neustadt wrote a book about thinking in time. They noted that policymakers and scholars always use historical analogies. Unfortunately, they said, those analogies were often used quite badly. May and Neustadt didn't argue against using analogies. They said that they should be employed carefully. They should be used in nuanced ways to clarify context, to clarify options, to clarify dilemmas. The ultimate goal of thinking in time, wrote May and Neustadt, the ultimate goal was to nurture prudence. So today, we need to ponder whether we are in a Cold War with China, whether thinking that we are in a Cold War with China helps to illuminate a constructive path to design our national security strategy. Does it help to measure threats, define vital interests, assess opportunities, and clarify options? Does it instruct on how to use power to nurture prudence in the pursuit of our most vital interests? My argument today is in two parts. I'm going to argue that we can learn many things from the Cold War, but I'm also going to argue that as an analogy, it is misleading and counterproductive. The context today is entirely different. The configuration of power in the international arena today is entirely different from what it was when the Cold War got underway. The ideological and economic dimensions are vastly different. The Cold War analogy, therefore, exaggerates the threat emanating from China, overlooks the saliency of China's strengths, and misconstrues opportunities. Although the Cold War was not the worst possible scenario after World War II, it nonetheless entailed great costs. In monetary terms, according to some economists, the Cold War is estimated to have cost the United States about $8 to $10 trillion. Geopolitically, the Cold War divided Europe and Germany for 40 years. The Cold War generated hot wars on the periphery, costing over 100,000 American lives and millions of Vietnamese and Korean lives, among others. The Cold War exacerbated regional and local conflicts in the Middle East, in Africa, and in Asia. It led to McCarthyism and repression at home. Although the Cold War did end in a peaceful victory for the West, no one should minimize its costs. Although we do have a rivalry with China, although we do have a great power competition with China, we should not seek to turn that rivalry into a Cold War. So let me begin with reminding you what was the Cold War. The Cold War was a zero-sum geopolitical, ideological, and economic struggle between countries who denied the legitimacy of the other's political economic system, between countries and governments who defined victory in terms of the destruction of the other's core values. George Kennan, the father of the containment policy, described the motives of the leaders of the Kremlin in the long telegram. They lusted, Kennan wrote, they lusted for, quote, the total destruction of rival power. These leaders would never feel secure, Kennan wrote. They would never feel secure until they destroyed the internal harmony of our society and our traditional way of life. In turn, Paul Nitze and his colleagues who wrote NSC 68, the major document outlining America's Cold War strategy, they stated that, quote, we Americans can expect no lasting settlement of the Cold War, no lasting abatement of the Cold War until change occurred in the nature of the Soviet system, until their system, collapsed, or was transformed. Now, the saliency of any analogy depends on getting the context right. So let me explain first why the context today is so different. First, let's look at this geostrategic dimension and the distribution of power. At the end of World War II, in the middle 1940s, a bipolar system of international politics emerged. But it was a very peculiar bipolarity. The United States was vastly stronger than the Soviet Union, but the Soviet Union had tremendous potential to make geopolitical gains. Surrounding Soviet Russia were huge vacuums of power. Soviet armies occupied most of Eastern Europe and parts of Northeast Asia. Germany and Japan were defeated and occupied. China was engulfed in a brutal civil war. Western European countries were beleaguered with political ferment, social strife, and economic and financial chaos. Their colonies were in revolt. Britain faced financial bankruptcy, forced to withdraw from the Eastern Mediterranean and South Asia. The United States, of course, participated in the occupation of Germany and monopolized the occupation of Japan. But everyone, meaning friends, foes, and Americans themselves, everyone believed the United States would withdraw shortly. The United States then had no alliances, no peacetime strategic commitments. As a result, the Soviet Union possessed vast opportunities to capitalize on these vacuums of power. The Soviet Union appeared to have a chance, even in peacetime, to gain direct or indirect control over the preponderant resources of Europe and Asia, much as the Axis powers had done in the late 1930s and early 1940s. This specter was the overriding national security threat in the aftermath of World War II. The prospect of the Kremlin, controlling the critical resources of the industrial heartlands of Europe and Asia. The Soviet Union might then be able to wage a protracted struggle against the United States in wartime, or to undermine the viability of the American economy in peacetime. In the first overall strategy paper of the Cold War, NSC 20-4, US policymakers concluded, quote, Soviet domination of the potential power of Eurasia, whether achieved by armed aggression or by political and subversive means, would be strategically and politically unacceptable to the United States, end quote. That was then. Now let's fast forward today and consider the current geopolitical context and the distribution of power. China today is surrounded by a proud and wealthy Japan. China today is surrounded by a robust and nationalist India. China today is surrounded by a rich and competitive South Korea. China today is surrounded by countries with whom the United States has alliances, bases, and military arrangements, countries like Japan, South Korea, and the Philippines. China today has no ability to make geopolitical gains comparable to the ones that US leaders thought the Soviet Union could make when the Cold War began. Now let's turn to the ideological dimension. After World War II, capitalism was in disrepute after 2 world wars and a Great Depression. The left was on the rise everywhere. Socialism, planning, land redistribution, and command economies had vast support. Communist parties had great appeal in countries like France and Italy. In England, the Labour Party, a socialist party, gained power in 1945. In Southeast Asia, the Middle East, and Africa, Marxist, Leninist ideas resonated with an emerging generation of revolutionary nationalist leaders. Marxism, Leninism resonated with these leaders, not because they were communists. Most of them were not. But most of them embraced the idea that their countries were backward because of imperial greed, capitalist exploitation, and white racism. These revolutionary nationalist leaders believed that planning, nationalization, and statist policies could produce modernization, power, and higher standards of living. In short, at the onset of the Cold War, there was a rival ideology with vast appeal, a rival ideology that challenged private property, free enterprise, individual liberty, and a marketplace economy. A rival ideology calling for justice, equality, opportunity, and modernity. A rival ideology seemingly headquartered in the capital of the Soviet Union. Now let's fast forward again to today. China has no ideology comparable to the appeal of Marxism, Leninism, socialism, and communism in the aftermath of World War II. China today offers no such universal, inspirational message. Xi Jinping trumpets, quote, socialism with Chinese characteristics. His message is nationalistic, not universalist. He doesn't assail capitalism as a system. He doesn't call for revolution. His speeches mostly champion modernization, technological innovation, development, and higher standards of living. He opposes hegemony and advocates multipolarity. Although he does extol China's great accomplishments and its glorious heritage, his speeches call for an open international marketplace, for stability and peace, for more trade and more investment and more infrastructure. And almost everywhere around the world, people appreciate Chinese success, and they want Chinese capital and Chinese markets. But they also grasp China's nationalist ethos and ambitions. Almost everywhere around the globe, views of China have grown starkly more negative over the last decade. In short, the ideological competition from China is not at all comparable to that of the Soviet Union in the early decades of the Cold War. And now let's look at the economic context. At the end of World War II, the United States had 2/3 of the world's gold reserves and 3/4 of its invested capital. More than half of the entire world's manufacturing capability was located in the United States, and America's GDP was 3 times that of the Soviet Union, 5 times that of Britain. The United States was the world's economic and financial hegemon. But after the end of Lend-Lease in 1945, the United States had virtually no economic and financial ties with the Soviet Union. There were no post-war loans or investments. Indeed, while the United States yearned to create an open international global marketplace, the Soviet Union sought to isolate itself and its bloc from the rest of the world economy. Now again, let's fast forward and grasp how different the world is today. How different. China's GDP, depending on how you measure it, roughly equals that of the United States. China is central to the health of the international economy. It's the world's leading trader. It's the third most important trading partner of the United States. It holds about $750 billion of US bonds and treasury bills, more than any other countries except Japan. The United States is now a debtor nation, running huge trade and budgetary deficits, totally unlike after World War II. So what does all this mean in terms of the way the United States should think about national security? Simply stated, starkly stated, the contrasting geopolitical, ideological, and economic circumstances mean that threats and opportunities today are totally dissimilar to the Cold War. Cold War analogies, therefore, make little sense. The threat today from China is nothing like the threat emanating from the Soviet Union after World War II. China has no prospect of gaining control over the preponderant resources of Asia and Europe. When China today takes aggressive actions like building makeshift islands in the South China Sea, challenging Vietnam over the Spratly Islands, or contesting the Scarborough Straits with the Philippines, we do need to focus on these developments. But we also need to recognize how vastly different such actions are from Soviet practices on its periphery at the onset of the Cold War. At that time, the Kremlin's armies dominated political life in East Germany, Poland, Romania, Czechoslovakia, and Bulgaria. These armies then acted to cement the monopoly of power of communist parties in all of those countries. The different geopolitical, ideological, and economic contexts also mean that opportunities today are very different. The United States doesn't have the financial leverage to reshape the world as it did at Bretton Woods when it launched, or when it launched the Marshall Plan, or when it reshaped occupation policies in the western zones of Germany and Japan. Nor does the United States have the strategic heft that it had at the onset of the Cold War. Truman's Cold Warriors believe that the Soviet Union wanted to destroy America's way of life. But Truman's Cold Warriors also believed that the Kremlin would retreat when confronted with superior American power. That was the fundamental axiom of Kennan's containment policy. Russia, Kennan stressed, quote, is still by far the weaker party. Such axioms don't prevail today. Altered circumstances, therefore, impel a cost-benefit analysis of the Cold War strategy, of the Cold War analogy. In the mid and late 1940s, the costs of a prospective Cold War seemed low compared to the prospective benefits. The existing status quo was portentous. If the United States did nothing, the Kremlin might gain, directly or indirectly, control over the preponderant resources of Europe and Asia. If the United States took action, the Kremlin might clamp down in Eastern Europe, as it did, but the United States would gain a preponderant position in Western Europe, Western Germany, and Northeast Asia. Kennan and his colleagues grasped these trade-offs when they declared the Truman Doctrine, launched the Marshall Plan, proceeded with the unification of the Western zones in Germany, and agreed to join a North Atlantic alliance. They believed that prospective gains exceeded prospective losses. The Soviet Union had scant ability to inflict economic or financial harm and would hesitate to challenge America's strategic superiority. Stalin, of course, did blockade Berlin, but faced with determination and an airlift, Stalin backed down. He knew the United States still had an atomic monopoly. Although that monopoly soon did end, throughout the 1950s, the United States possessed vastly greater strategic capabilities than the Soviet Union. Today, prospective costs are so much greater, and prospective benefits so much smaller. The benefits are smaller because the Eurasian balance of power is not in question, and our existing allies along China's periphery do not want a Cold War. Turning a rival into an enemy makes little sense when that rival, unlike the Soviet Union, constitutes the hub of an international economy in which the United States and its allies have a vital stake. Turning a rival into an enemy makes little sense when that rival, unlike the Soviet Union, is a critical trading partner and creditor and can inflict heavy costs. Turning a rival into an enemy makes little sense when that rival is now gathering a formidable military capability and modernizing and enlarging its nuclear arsenal. Moreover, turning a rival into an enemy makes even less sense when you need that rival's cooperation to deal with fundamental threats that are endangering vital U.S. interests. When the Cold War began, no one doubted that the most critical factor affecting the national security interests of the United States related to the configuration of power in Eurasia. But today, pandemics, climate change, and drug trafficking loom as very large, or even larger, threats to our national security. And to deal with these threats, we need transnational cooperation. During the recent pandemic, more Americans died than during World War II. More harm was inflicted on the U.S. economy by the pandemic than is likely to be inflicted by any prospective geopolitical foe. Likewise, more damage to the nation's health, productivity, and infrastructure and environment, more damage is likely to come from climate change over the next 50 or 60 years than is likely to emanate from China or any other foe. The fourth and fifth national climate assessments of the U.S. Global Change Research Program, completed in 2008 to 2018 and then again in 2023, these assessments estimated that the damage emanating from climate change inside the United States, from floods, droughts, environmental degradation, etc., would equal hundreds of billions, that's with a B, hundreds of billions of dollars annually during the final decades of this century. I dare say that there is more certainty about climate change than there is certainty about how China will evolve and what China will do over the next 50 or 60 years. And to deal with such factors like climate change and disease and drug trafficking, we need China's cooperation, not its hostility. So why invoke a Cold War analogy when doing so is likely to produce more harm than good? Why make China into an existential enemy when it constitutes a normal great power with whom competition is inevitable, but with whom cooperation is also indispensable? Context makes the Cold War analogy inappropriate, and prudence demands that we reject it, lest we produce an outcome that will cost us more than it will benefit us. But there are lessons to be gleaned from the Cold War about managing a great power rivalry. And let's not kid ourselves. China is a formidable rival. China is building up its stockpile of strategic nuclear warheads, constructing hundreds of new missile sites, and expanding its power production capabilities. China seeks to expand its economic and cultural influence around the globe, and China tries all the time to reshape the norms and standards of multilateral institutions. And its repressive actions at home, its clampdown in Hong Kong, and its aggressive posture towards Taiwan should give us much cause to worry. So what are the lessons of the Cold War with the Soviet Union that might guide U.S. policy in the future? What are the instructive lessons of the Cold War? First, I would say we need a coherent conception of vital interests and national security. After World War II, at the onset of the Cold War, policymakers defined America's vital security, as I've said, in terms of denying any adversary or coalition of adversaries control over the centers of industrial and economic power in Western Europe and Northeast Asia. Ronald Reagan's final national security strategy statement in 1988 summed all this up very succinctly. It said, quote, "Every administration since World War II has endorsed the concept that the United States, in partnership with its allies, must prevent the Soviet Union from dominating those great concentrations of industrial power and human capacity that are Western Europe and East Asia," end quote. This conception was based on the lessons of the Great Depression and the struggle against the Axis powers. This conception took cognizance of what the United States needed in order to flourish economically, and what it would take to defeat a prospective foe militarily in a future conventional war. It fused economic, strategic, technological, social, and political variables. It was a conception that demanded rigorous and continuous rethinking if it were to be implemented cost effectively. That did not happen. Nonetheless, we need some such clear conception today. I don't think we have it. Instead, we talk about peer competitors, and ratios of economic and military power without illuminating how, where, and whether the stakes of competition relate to our own concrete vital interests, without clarifying whether ratios of economic and military capabilities truly affect the tangible, concrete interests of the United States. We need to define those interests, identify priorities, and most of all, explain why they are vital if they are vital. Another key lesson of the Cold War is that competition, however intense, must not lead to hot war. All through the Cold War, while practicing deterrence based on a robust conception of second strike capabilities, and while practicing containment, U.S. presidents nevertheless realized that a hot war with the Soviet Union must be avoided. They grasped that such a hot war would be catastrophic. Hence, they signed arms control agreements, established a hotline to the Kremlin to facilitate communication, labored to thwart the proliferation of nuclear weapons, and negotiated confidence-building measures that sought to mitigate fears of a surprise attack. To avoid a hot war, American policymakers grasped the Kremlin's red lines. American presidents did not challenge the Soviet sphere of influence in Eastern Europe. Eisenhower, for example, rejected the strategy of liberation, stuck with containment, and did not intervene when revolutionary turmoil in East Germany, Hungary, and Poland provided opportunities to do so. This suggests the importance of studying and grasping China's own red lines. The Cold War, after all, taught us much about security dilemmas and spiraling distrust. Our rivals, even our enemies, have vital strategic interests of their own, and they too often yearn for respect and legitimacy. Sergei Radchenko's new award-winning book, notwithstanding its totally misleading title, To Run the World, demonstrates how essential it is to appreciate the adversary's sensibilities, to understand its history and culture, to grasp its perception of its own vital interests, and to treat it with respect. To avoid spiraling distrust, U.S. officials must recognize that China is a normal great power operating in a world of uncertainty, obsessed with its own regime survival, and grappling with its own acute vulnerabilities, such as the fact that its economy is heavily dependent on oil imports, 80% of which traverse the Straits of Malacca. From the Cold War, we also learned that competition, even containment, must not exclude cooperation. Throughout the Cold War, American officials identified areas of mutual interest, like neutralizing Austria, outlawing military activity in the Antarctic, limiting nuclear testing in the atmosphere, and collaborating to fight disease like smallpox. Likewise today, common sense dictates that the two great powers, in the midst of their competition, collaborate to deal with climate change, thwart the spread of pandemics, and grapple with the traffic in drugs like fentanyl that have killed hundreds of thousands of Americans. During the Cold War with the Soviet Union, cooperation required painstaking diplomacy on each of the items noted above. So did the financial and trade regimes that were designed at Bretton Woods and Geneva, regimes and agreements that the Kremlin chose to reject. With its friends and prospective allies, Washington then proceeded to use its economic and financial power to nurture an open international economic order, friendly to the movement of goods, services, and capital. That open international order generated economic growth, helped reconstruct and co-opt former enemies, lured and enticed adversaries, and bred higher standards of living. That open international order, as originally conceived, needed to complement domestic economic sovereignty and state welfare policies. That international order, sometimes called embedded liberalism, was what Bretton Woods was all about. And it produced greater income equality at home and better standards of living in most developed countries. That system of embedded liberalism did stagnate in the 1970s. But it was the neoliberal turn to globalism that subsequently distorted the balance between markets and the state, eroded the manufacturing sector of the United States, marginalized labor unions, and devastated many US urban centers. The challenge in the future, as it has always been, is to find the right balance between the market and the state. The state, after all, played a decisive role during the early decades of the Cold War. Defense expenditures spurred technological innovation and productivity gains. Not only bombs and missiles, but transistors, communication satellites, optical fibers, semiconductors, and the internet were the outgrowth of government expenditures on basic research and development. However, for many decades now, US government funding as a percentage of total funding for scientific research and development, both nationally and globally, has declined dramatically. This erosion has affected defense capabilities, productivity gains, and overall economic growth. When pondering the economic rivalry between the United States and China today, the Cold War teaches how important is the state's role in providing incentives to remain ahead in technologies that shape military capabilities and business competitiveness. The Cold War also underscores the critical importance of allies. After World War II, the United States co-opted former enemies like West Germany and Japan and enticed them into collaborative relationships that benefited all the partners. At the same time, Washington offered security guarantees to countries threatened by the rebuilding of German and Japanese power, and bound them into alliances that proclaimed the values of freedom and markets while constraining the appeal of command economies and the military power of the Kremlin. When today, China endears itself to dictatorial regimes akin to its own, and when it employs its own market power to lure friends and foes, America must turn to its allies in Asia and the Pacific. Japan, South Korea, the Philippines, and Australia offer the potential to contain a great power rival without overburdening America's own capabilities. But in embracing allies, the United States must learn another crucial lesson from the Cold War: defining priorities. whereas embracing allies with critical natural resources, industrial infrastructure, and skilled labor made eminent sense to gain preponderance in Eurasia, overcommitting to governments in peripheral areas and dubious values drained America's strength and tarnished its reputation, distinguishing vital interests from secondary interests, avoiding wars on the periphery, like the one in Indochina, is a critical lesson of the Cold War. During the Cold War, ideological assumptions sometimes blinded officials from practicing strategies to divide adversaries. Although American officials talked about driving a wedge between the People's Republic of China and the USSR for almost 2 decades, that strategy was not adopted until President Richard Nixon embraced it in the early 1970s. That wedge policy paid rich dividends, and it should instruct officials to remain cognizant of the potential rifts in the alliances of autocracies that is now often referred to, the kinship between Russia, China, Iran, and North Korea. Any study of the Cold War should heighten awareness of the nationalist emotions, territorial disputes, and cultural and racial sensibilities that might be exploited to accentuate rifts amongst these adversaries. They are not natural allies, as any student of Soviet-Chinese relations during the Cold War knows. In the rivalry with the Soviet Union during the Cold War, the United States used multilateral institutions like the World Bank, the IMF, the United Nations, the OAS, and many others to build a world order friendly to U.S. interests and allies. Often such efforts required laborious, tedious diplomacy and unsavory compromises. But the payoff was considerable in setting norms and shaping correlations of power. Looking ahead, international institutions and multilateral fora are where standards will be set and norms established regarding artificial intelligence, drug trafficking, carbon emissions, counterterrorist practices, human rights, seabed drilling, pandemic warnings, and nuclear proliferation. The United States must stay involved because Beijing, in the words of one recent scholar, is seeking to use multilateral institutions to drain liberalism from the international order. Liberal values and national interests sometimes conflict, and observers should never ignore that reality. But in the Cold War with Soviet Russia, American officials learned to employ liberal values and human rights in ways that undercut communist propaganda and subverted the Soviet system. During the 1970s, for lots of different reasons, the United States transitioned to policies that dwelled on championing human rights, especially inside the Soviet bloc. Over the last 20 years, book after book has demonstrated that the rhetoric of human rights and the painstaking, courageous work of human rights organizations and nonprofit groups, as well as quasi-governmental agencies like the National Endowment for Democracy, played a significant role in exploiting the seething unrest inside the Soviet bloc and inside Soviet Russia itself. The lesson here is clear. The lesson here is clear. Liberal values matter. Soft power counts. Muting the voice of America, killing the United States Institute for Peace, shutting down the Agency for International Development are self-defeating measures if the United States hopes to thwart its great power rival. Among the many lessons of the Cold War, there's one, in my opinion, that stands out and remains more important than any of the others. The West won the Cold War because the United States and its allies in Western Europe and Northeast Asia made liberal capitalism and social democracy work for most of their citizens. Policymakers demonstrated the superiority of their system over command economies and totalitarian governments. Officials in the Western world learned to use the state to complement the market, and they labored to provide minimum health care, educational opportunity, and social security to their citizens. They expanded the rights of women and minorities and struggled to reduce inequality. Soviet Russia could not fulfill its promises to its own citizens. Its government was repudiated and its system demolished. China today is vulnerable, and regime leaders there grasp that fact. But trust in our own government has nearly vanished. Inequality has grown, and disputes over our fundamental values deeply divide us. We too are vulnerable. We cannot win a great power competition without overcoming these formidable domestic obstacles. And foreign policy must be made with an understanding that power depends on the vitality and appeal of one's own political economy and regime type. In conclusion, then, I would stress that we can learn a lot from the Cold War, even though we are not in a Cold War and should not want to be in one. Properly understood, by recognizing both the failures as well as the successes of our policies, the Cold War can illuminate how to construct a coherent definition of vital interests, how to conduct our diplomacy intelligently, and how to use the market and the state to nurture prosperity at home and abroad. Properly understood, the Cold War can teach us how to use our own power prudently in a complicated, competitive world. Thank you. Thanks. Yep.
We'll go ahead and do one question. Since we started a little bit late, we'll take time for one. And I knew that Jeremy was going to have one and that it would be good. So why don't we go to Jeremy?
If it's not good, I'll just ignore it. We'll have a different one.
So Mel, that's, I mean, as one would have expected, that was a tour de force. I mean, you covered so much, and you gave us some really powerful lessons here. But I wonder why, for you, the question of how much of this is the Cold War or not is about the U.S. and China, and not about why it isn't about the U.S. and Russia today. How would your analysis be different?
Because China, I have a simple answer. China has so much more potential power than Russia today. That's my simple answer. That's why I think the focus must be on China. And generally, when we talk about another Cold War or Cold War II or III, we talk about it not with Russia, but with China because of a perception of the relative strengths of China and Russia. All right.
All right, for our first panel and our only panel for today, and I will note that we actually lost 3 conference participants just in the past few weeks, 2 for illness and 1 for unanticipated extreme demands at work. And this is not the kind of project that lends itself to late substitutions because the work is too weighty. So a couple of our panels will be 1 person short, and our next is one of them, but in no way are they short on substance. And as we go through the conference, I'll merely introduce the moderator, and the moderators in turn will in different ways introduce their panelists. So our moderator is the esteemed Honorable Elliott Cohen, currently Arleigh Burke Chair in Strategic Studies at CSIS and Professor Emeritus at Johns Hopkins University. Elliott has served in many senior roles as both a scholar and a practitioner, most prominently, of course, as counselor of the Department of State. So please welcome with me the Honorable Elliott Cohen and the panelists for Military Power, Lessons from the Cold War.
We all sit down. I do have to correct you, unfortunately, and Vice Admiral McGuire. You introduced me as honorable. I was a dean. And if you ever had any pretensions to be honorable, that terminates it. But I appreciate the compliment. It's great to be here. It's great to be here with a lot of old friends, some of whom I haven't seen in a long time. It is extremely difficult to follow Mel Leffler. That was a tour de force. It really was. We have only an hour. I am not going to go in for long-winded introductions because presumably everybody here is literate and can read the bios that we've got. We have Tommy Jameson and Simon Miles. What I think I'd like to ask you to do is the theme is military power and lessons from the Cold War. What I think I'd like to ask each of you to do is to make however long a set of remarks you would like. I think it'd be good if we could keep them to like 5 to 10 minutes of sort of bullets to throw out to people. I'm going to kibitz a little bit, maybe a little bit of discussion among ourselves, and then invite the audience to participate. I'm getting the thumbs up from Jeremy. That's a good sign. Okay.
Okay, thanks so much for the opportunity to be here. Thanks for the introduction. The topic that I want to address today is that of military preparation during times of Cold War, which is a tricky thing for military officers and advocates to do because they typically feature a great deal of technological uncertainty and geopolitical flux. Military advocates have a number of tools that they can throw at this problem to try to get the crystal ball out, to look into the seeds of time and say which grain will grow and which will not. Among those are war games, models. They can send attachés to other people's wars to try to derive meaning from them. But I'm particularly taken by a recent vogue, maybe a resurgence, for future war fiction, ficant, or future or useful fiction, future war stories, techno-thrillers. You all have seen these on the bookshelves: Ghost Fleet 2034, White Sun War. These, I think, are valuable objects for us for understanding both our present moment of geopolitical rivalry with China and also for understanding previous Cold Wars. Indeed, I think it's probably better to think about these books, which many people read, including senior policy makers, as artifacts of long peaces. They grow out of long sustained periods of peace in which military technology proceeds apace. That creates uncertainty, and as a result, people have to use their imaginations to get around the new implications of new weapon systems. They also grow out of periods of political rivalry and enmity. You have to have an adversary to have a good narrative about the future of warfare. There are a number of dangers to this genre, to using fiction as a way of thinking about military preparation. Chiefly, the predictive value of them from a historical perspective is low. There are many more misses than there are accurate predictions about what the future will be. And also because you risk creating out of an adversary or a potential adversary and identifying an adversary a sense of enmity. Christopher Clark has this great expression about Germany and Britain before World War I, and the British are painting the devil on the wall when they describe Germany. That said, I think they are tremendously useful, maybe in the same way that Professor Leffler has just encouraged us to think about analogies, the way May and Neustadt described them, as a way of thinking about problems, thinking through problems, almost as a mental gymnastic that gives us space to think about things that are difficult, to experiment with, and certainly things that we don't want to get empirical evidence about. The future of conflict, ideally, we would create military forces that deter war. They're useful to us, but they carry with them a number of biases. And I think chiefly these are, if we adopt a historical perspective, a prediction of a short, sharp war, the emergence of a decisive military technology, all of which are both of which are somewhat dubious in terms of whether or not they manifest on the battlefields of the future. There have been waves of these over time. I'm particularly taken by the Victorian era of future war fiction, which grows out of similar conditions to those that emerged during Cold War I and Cold War 2.0. So I might call it Cold War beta during the Victorian period. A moment of industrialization, which creates technological uncertainty, a moment in which authors in the United Kingdom and the United States are flogging the issue of military preparedness and peacetime so as to increase budgets and to create new interest in advanced technologies to go out and win the next war, to write basically fake stories about real recommendations for possible future conflicts. Maybe the best of the bunch is written by a name that should be familiar to you all, F.T. Jane, as in the Jane behind All the Worlds of Fighting Ships. Before he writes that encyclopedic volumes, authors those, edits those, he actually makes an effort as a novelist. And he writes a story about a British fleet that is sunk at anchor by a perfidious attack by Franco-Russian torpedo boats, and a plucky set of torpedo boat captains in the Royal Navy who respond with a sort of miracle weapon, the automobile torpedo, to frustrate a continental invasion of Great Britain. Which, if that sounds a little bit like the plot of Ghost Fleet, I think it should. You know, it's almost by design that there's a parallel there. There's quite a gap, I think, between this era of future war fiction when it really blossoms in the Victorian period, and the next wave that people are likely familiar with, and that's during the late Cold War, during détente, in the late 1970s and the 1980s. But again, these are growing out of similar conditions. During World War I and World War II, no one needs to imagine the future of war. They're getting hard experience from it. And indeed, those experiences cast a very long shadow across the 1950s and the 1960s. The fall of France and the success of the German Blitzkrieg is particularly ponderous, maybe even insidious in its effect on US strategic and tactical imaginations. But by the time we get to the 70s and 80s, enough time has passed, enough technological development has proceeded, has progressed, to create all sorts of questions about what a war would look like, what a conventional war would look like in Europe. And lo, behold, owing to much the same stimuli, owing to much of the same uncertainty, geopolitically and technologically, we get future war fictions that are aimed at policymakers, and designed to encourage them to do similar things to what the Victorians were advocating for, to prepare for war in time of peace, and to invest in modern technologies that are capable of winning this war. Hackett's The Third World War and its derivations is a fantastic example of this genre. The more familiar one, because it's a better story, it's a better book, is of course Red Storm Rising by Larry Bond and Tom Clancy, which Jeremy's student, Ben Griffin, have written an excellent book on. This is not something that just sits on the bestsellers list. It's something that actually has a tangible effect on policymakers and the way they think about the future of conflict. It makes it legible to them, and in making it legible, it also makes it communicable to the American public, who at the end of the day have to fund these weapon systems and pay for the people who are going to use them in combat. It's a good news story as well, much in the way that Jane is able to send out his torpedo boat skippers to destroy a Franco-Russian invasion overnight. So too is the United States and NATO as a result of acquisitions and investments in technologies that master the electromagnetic spectrum and also critically contest space, anti-satellite weapons, through the mastery of these sorts of advanced technologies, the conventional forces are enough. They're able to defeat the Soviet Union and preserve the balance of power, and indeed to foment the collapse of the Soviet Union. That's aspirational. It's a good story, and that good story actually gains a considerable amount of traction in U.S. political circles and certainly in popular imagination. Now, fortunately, no one ever fights that war in Europe, but we're in a similar moment today, and if we're in a Cold War with China or not, we're certainly seeing another wave of future war fiction that looks an awful lot like that which attended Cold War 1.0 in the 1970s and the 1980s. I think the most substantial, the most influential books written so far in this genre are Ghost Fleet, 2034, and White Sun War. And I also think these are sort of the best and most interesting as well. So popular acclaim actually coincides with the substance of these books, which is awfully nice. In two of these, we have a story about advanced conventional weapons and their utility against the People's Republic of China. For Singer and Cole, it's a railgun, which appears like almost a deus ex machina. Sorry if I'm spoiling this for anyone. To defeat the People's Liberation Army Navy in the same way that we get anti-satellite weapons or torpedoes in the Victorian era or in Cold War 1.0. In White Sun War, it's robotics teamed with humans, autonomous systems that are able to frustrate and complicate a PLA invasion of the island of Taiwan, which I value and I appreciate because it actually dovetails extremely well, not only with conversations that we are having in the United States, but also with doctrinal publications and debates that are happening in Taiwan about the overall defense concept and how to structure a military to overcome their obvious asymmetric deficiencies vis-a-vis China, vis-a-vis the People's Liberation Army and a possible invasion. Only one of these really contemplates a future in which nuclear weapons are exchanged, and that's 2034. But even that is relatively limited, and even that features a miracle weapon of its own, which is a devastating cyber attack against the United States. So all of this, an emphasis on short, sharp wars that are dominated by conventional weapons, that are feature deus ex machina interventions of advanced technologies about which we have little empirical evidence to date, and which successfully identify an adversary on the continent of Eurasia are common features of these genres. And they carry within them some limitations on their own, but I think as a genre, they're also tremendously useful as a way of influencing policymakers on the cheap and thinking through problems in real time. We have to think about, imagine future possibilities as the first step towards realizing those possibilities. And I think in imagining future challenges and imagining the future dynamics of a conflict, these authors have at least put us on the step towards addressing them in going forward.
Thank you. That was fascinating. Simon.
Thanks. So I approach the question of the military history lessons that we can learn from the Cold War as someone who's really squarely focused on Eastern Bloc and Soviet history. And I think that's actually quite opposite, because when we think about the force structure and doctrinal bases of both the People's Liberation Army and, of course, the Russian military, and I do think it's fair to count those both seriously. I think that, for example, the recent Commission on the National Defense Strategy was right to chastise the authors of the NDS for underweighting the threat posed by Russia. There is so much similarity that I think there's a lot of really interesting learning to be done from the extraordinarily accessible but also extraordinarily voluminous Eastern Bloc archives, in which I think it's fair to say both my wife and my former grad school mentors think I spend much too much time. The first of these is probably a perpetual kind of historian's quibble, but I think it's a really, really important quibble to make when we're engaged in exactly this type of exercise. And that is to be sure that we're not conflating correlation and causation. That is to say, and here I'm focusing on the defense of Europe, which was the principal theater of the Cold War as I understand it, just because you do X with the intention of preventing Y, and Y does not transpire, does not mean that X prevented Y. That I just framed it that way probably tells you that I spend much too much time in the company of social scientists in the School of Public Policy at Duke. But I think it's a valuable taxonomy. And one of the most interesting themes that I find when I go through Eastern Bloc military archives is, for example, the very willingness of military planners and exercise designers to basically call the American bluff that Charles de Gaulle most famously postulated when he asked if the United States would actually trade New York for Paris. I could kind of describe these plans at great length, but what is fascinating is that they are sketched out based on the assumption that when push comes to shove, the United States won't. And so I think when it comes to both deterrence and compellence, we really need to be serious about digging into actual causal mechanisms. Because sometimes the Poles actually would sketch out invading all the way up to northern France and basically dropping nuclear bombs their whole way along. And now I want to talk about who is actually dropping the aforementioned nuclear bombs, and that gets me to the second lesson for me from military history, which is the complexity of allies. We are in an alliance world today, as we were during the Cold War. And the Warsaw Pact is this fascinating animal to study because, of course, well, if you're studying the military history of it, the only time they went to war was when they invaded themselves, of course, in 1968. But it was this fascinating story of disobedience on the domestic policy front, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, disobedience on the foreign policy front, Albania, Romania. But also, in some ways, it was much closer than we ever knew. So, for example, during the mid to late 1960s, plans were drawn up and executed to provide, at the very least, Poland, Hungary, East Germany, and Czechoslovakia with nuclear weapons to use themselves. So the Polish case is called Wisła, which is the name of the major river that runs through Poland. The Soviets built and staffed 3 underground bunkers, which were full of tactical nuclear weapons, which they were going to give to the Polish military to actually use in the event of the outbreak of general war, including in these aforementioned offensive scenarios. And so what we learn from the military history of the Cold War, I think, is that oftentimes when it comes to alliances, proxies, partners, what have you, there's more than meets the eye, right? Whether that is sometimes frightening degrees of close coordination, which we didn't really know about, in large part because almost all of the documentation on these programs was destroyed, except they got a little sloppy in Poland, which is why we know this case pretty well, actually. But also to call into question when we fall back on really easy tropes about so-and-so Iranian proxies and Hezbollah, the Houthis, which is not completely untrue, but is more complicated than just that. So too, I think, for Russian proxies, for example, in the Donbass militias. Look, for example, at the career of people like Igor Girkin, alias Strelkov, which has not exactly gone, I think it's fair to say, according to plan. The third big lesson that I take away from the study of the Cold War, especially the Eastern Bloc's Cold War, is that Orbats don't fight. Line and block charts do not actually go to war, people do. And it has been fascinating to me as I work through various of the sort of military high command journals, which all have a name that's a variation of military thought. The Soviet one, Voyenная Mysl, there's a Czech one, an East German one, also there was a Warsaw Pact one, which is actually very interesting. They're obsessed with this idea of force quality, and above all, reliability. What is going to happen when we take these conscripts of varying degrees of willingness and actually send them into the fight, especially because a whole lot of our military doctrine involves fighting through fallout. And there's very few less appealing prospects than going with questionable equipment into the fallout zone of a tactical nuclear weapon. They obsessed over this. And bringing the case to today, I think if the experts had been right, I'll leave it up to you whether I just put air quotes around experts there. If the experts had been right, of course, the Russian invasion of Ukraine would have been over in 3 days, right, because of math. because the orbats, the line and block charts, looked so wildly disparate. But of course, the people who made up those little squares also were wildly disparate, in this case, in the Ukrainians' advantage. And the final point that I want to make has to do with ideology. I think it's undeniable that whether it's today or during the Cold War, ideology is part of how these states define themselves, even if it's not necessarily today part of how they kind of sell themselves to putative partners. But it would be a mistake to conflate rigid ideology, as, for example, the Soviet Union had, with an inability to adapt and innovate. And I think that was a critical mistake that was made during the early days of the Ukraine war, that failed to understand the extent to which the Russian military could actually innovate and adapt to changing realities on the battlefield. I got this idea originally, actually, when I was working on a little project about the KGB, drawing on basically the KGB's top secret in-house journal, in which I came across this little story from the Leningrad KGB in the year 1988, who had come across this young, promising science student who was, as many did at the time, making a living selling audiovisual equipment that he got smuggled in from the West. And they said, we worked out that there was no way that we could sort of give this young man a 3-hour lecture on Engels and he would stop. And so they reached, of all places, for Dale Carnegie's How to Win Friends and Influence People. And this was their guide. Armed with, the arch capitalist's wisdom, they coaxed a confession out of the guy. And as an even more relevant case of this comes to us from Czechoslovakia in 1968, when a group of military officers at the Clement Gottwald Military Political Academy, which at that time was based in Prague, write a document which comes to be known as Memorandum 68, which is entirely based on the work of Hermann Kahn. These are committed, serious communists, and they are obsessed with the idea that the Marxist definition of war, which is basically inevitably absolute in a kind of Clausewitzian sense, is nonsense. And that Kahn's point that war is a spectrum, and it's actually extremely rare that you find yourself in a state of absolute peace and absolute war, was the way forward for Czechoslovak military strategy, because the status quo basically either condemned Czechoslovakia to irrelevance or annihilation. These were flexible thinkers working in inflexible environments. Now, the thanks that the Czechs who wrote Memorandum 68 got was that obviously after the crushing of the Prague Spring, they all got fired. The academy was completely razed, not literally. Everyone was fired, and it was moved all the way from Prague to Bratislava, which is, a step down, it has to be said. But still, I think it's important that we not close our minds to intellectual flexibility, even on the part of adversaries who look that way. So those four are really the big takeaways that I came away with, but I'm looking forward to continuing the conversation.
Great, thanks. So my thoughts actually start with a remark that was once made to me by my friend, the military historian Hugh Strawn, who is frequently called in by the British government. He said the big mistake they always make is they're asking historians for answers when really the only thing we're good at is coming up with questions. And I think he's absolutely right, actually. And what I thought I would do would be to mention, I think, 4 large issues where, our answer may be the two rivalries, conflicts, what have you, are completely different and there's nothing to learn, or maybe there is something. So the first has to do with the centrality of the nuclear balance. The very first course that I think I took on strategic issues, which was very much during the height of the Cold War in the late 70s, nuclear issues took up, I would say, about 80% of the syllabus. In retrospect, way too much. By contrast, today, there's very little discussion of the Sino-American nuclear balance. Does it make a difference? What kind of nuclear weapons, first jet, there's very, very little. plus the fact that you're now dealing with what is, from a nuclear point of view, a tripolar world. So I think there's some very interesting issues to think about there. The Chinese have clearly begun investing very heavily in expanding their nuclear arsenal. Do we really understand how they think about that? What consequences that would have? I don't know, but it seems to me it's one worth exploring. Second thing, a very large part of the military balance between West and East during the Cold War was quantitative. And it mattered. I mean, this is, I think, falls on from Professor Leffler's observations about Russian advantages going beyond, I would say, the early phases of the Cold War. Just Red Army was really big. And that was a very serious concern for American military planners. I remember vividly teaching at the Naval War College, and particularly the Army students who were present there were very much caught up in what was then the Army's central question, or it was actually sort of a proposition: fight outnumbered and win. And my late friend Williamson Murray, who was a fine German military historian, would always point out to them, particularly as they began nattering on about the Wehrmacht and Auftragstaktik and Schwerpunkts and stuff like that. He would say, just remember, the Wehrmacht fought outnumbered and lost, which is an important point. The United States is going up, or is engaged in a rivalry and a competition, and I think I basically agree with the idea that Cold War is not the right way to frame it, with an opponent who, from the quantitative point of view, is already, in some respects, way ahead of us, and will most definitely be way ahead of us. And particularly if you look at metrics like ship construction, or fifth-generation aircraft construction, all kinds of things. And, quantity, as the saying used to be, has a quality all its own. And so I think that's going to be something that will reward thought. The Cold War was, of course, a war which was fought along many dimensions. Here, it seems to me there may be some more interesting parallels. I'll leave aside for the moment the question of sort of attempts to wage ideological war, which goes on now. And the Chinese try to affect our internal politics, and social media gives them a vehicle for doing so. But let's set that aside. Just talk about the issue of proxy war. And proxy war is a feature of the Cold War, but actually it's a feature of most long-term rivalries. My first love is 17th and 18th century colonial military history. And a lot of the stuff that was happening in New England, where I grew up, and in upstate New York, was proxy warfare, with Brits and French getting Native Americans to do the killing for them, with various strategic purposes and different degrees of success. And today, too, the Chinese have their own distinctive way of doing this. They have not probably been shipping finished weapons to Russia, but they've been shipping a lot of components. They've been providing a lot of the material that you need for things like digging trenches. Why were the Russians able to dig trenches so quickly? A lot of that is Chinese earth-moving equipment. And there may be more. So I think thinking through how they conceptualize it and how they do it, and how we may end up doing it to them. Because the one war that, Mel, that you didn't mention was Afghanistan, which is us doing to the Russians what they did to us. And I find it very hard to believe, even if it's a rivalry rather than a Cold War, that proxy conflicts of that kind won't play some role in it. The last thing that I want to do is probably a bit of special pleading. Rivalries go on for a long time. I think that, and the Cold War went on for a long time. In that sort of situation, you would think that what you would be willing to invest in would be assessment of long-term competition. Now, in one of a number of acts of self-inflicted frontal lobotomies, we've just abolished the Office of Net Assessment, which conducted, or disestablished, I should say, which conducted what were really the dominant assessments of the long-term strategic competition between the United States and the Soviet Union. Whether that particular office is recreated or takes different forms, there's clearly, I think, going to be a need to think about a rivalry, not just in terms of managing crises and managing perennial friction points like Taiwan, but thinking about the nature and scope of a long-term competition which may have some hot elements, but will by and large be a form of shadow boxing, which in a way takes us back to the novels. So that, because you just find it harder and harder to imagine that. So those would be my thoughts. Those are terrific sets of remarks. Do you have anything you want to throw at each other or at me?
I mean, I love the fiction point. I'll just say that when I teach strategy through fiction.
Do you?
In part, I mean, obviously, we actually learned some history. They kick me out of my job if I don't do any of that. And I think that one of the points that I was trying to get across with my talk about ideology, and that I think you're exactly getting off there, is the issue of imagination. And I think actually for the last decades, we have suffered from a failure of imagination. It couldn't possibly be that bad. Oh no, it would never actually come to this. They won't actually invade. We have failed to imagine, and I think fiction reminds us of the importance of actually doing the hard work of imagining.
I think that's right. One of the things that strikes me about the Cold War is, by and large, you were dealing with evolved forms of World War II technology. And even in I vividly remember picking up John Hackett's Third World War. It's still and he had fought in World War II and been at Arnhem. It's still an evolved form of technology, which is why, my friend Mick Ryan, who's the author of one of those books, is a big proponent not only of war fiction, but of future war fiction, but of science fiction. The stuff that's really Ender's Game and stuff like that. Let me ask you, Simon, a question, and then we'll throw the floor open. Clearly one of the big issues, thinking about the effectiveness of the forces on the other side, is, as you say, they're obsessed by the question of, will their conscripts do what we want them to do? It has to do with the nature of the regime in which they're operating, which is very top-down, which this was not as much of an issue, I think, during the Cold War as it proved to be for the Russian army in the invasion of Ukraine. Deeply corrupt, with everything that goes along with that. Armies without real non-commissioned officer corps, as we would understand them, which is not maybe absolutely essential, but is really important. To the extent that you feel you understand similarities and differences between the PLA and the Soviet military, how do you think that weighs out?
Yeah, I think it's a really important question because, of course, I think the PLA is in some ways a more pointed threat to American interests. And it is a military that was built on the Soviet model. Yeah. The heritage, the DNA or what have you of the PLA and the Red Army, the Soviet Army, is a common heritage. And so I think the PLA suffers, or at least its leadership feels that they are at risk of suffering from both, of course, the corruption issue, and I think just this week, Xi Jinping fired another little smaller batch of lower tier generals. But whenever you're, turfing general officers at scale, I mean, this tells you you've got a really big problem. Now, I don't think we should ignore the fact that some of these corruption investigations are, shall we say, instrumental by the political leadership for political reasons, but the bottom line is that both of these militaries have in their DNA corruption. Everyone's kind of crooked. When Sergei Shoigu left the Russian Ministry of Defense, and there was this big range of corruption investigations in the wake of that, I mean, all these guys were crooked. The question was just, were you crooked on the right side or the wrong side of the boss? And I think that also the conscript question is a really important one. And whenever I make these points, I want to emphasize, one, the point that you made, which is that quantity has a quality all of its own, and we can go down the rabbit hole of the value of an NCO Corps, but also if you don't build an army like a British, American, or Canadian army that needs an NCO Corps, then you don't need an NCO Corps, right? If your doctrine is not predicated on that kind of mission command structure, we have seen the effectiveness of those types of armies. But I do think that the PLA must be and are very worried about not just the reliability of that at the top on the corruption front, but the reliability of their sort of rank and file, in part because of the very real dissatisfaction that exists in that system and in that regime. And in part because that is, I think, something that is by and large baked into not necessarily the conscript model of military. I don't think the Israelis have acute reliability concerns on the force quality front, but is undeniably something that they have to deal with because of how they've built their military.
Okay. Unless, Tommy, did you have anything you want to add?
I would say this point on the comparisons analogies between the modern PLA and either the historical example of the Russian military, the Soviet military, or the Russian military that goes into Ukraine in 2022. I've been struck by much of the tenor that's coming out of Chinese strategic journals about the failure of the Russian invasion. I expected that the failure of the Russians to seize Kyiv decisively in a swift in a swift campaign to have a salubrious effect on Chinese thinking about their ability to attack Taiwan. It seems like there are some heroic rationalizations about that lesson, that near-term historical lesson, in at least the outward-facing PLA journals. And that's for good reasons, I suppose. Taiwan doesn't have some of the geographic advantages that Ukraine has. It doesn't have strategic depth, and it doesn't have Poland next door where you can drive material over it. But it also seems to evoke and express what I read as a fairly sincere conviction that the military reforms that have been underway since the 1990s and which have accelerated in an era of informationized wars and intelligencized wars might be sticking in a substantial way that's going to have military effects on the battlefield.
You know, just to follow on from those two comments, one thought that occurs to me is, although on the one hand they do have kind of a common, there are elements of common origin, their fundamental historical reference points are totally different.
Yeah, totally.
You know, for the Soviet Union, it's the Great Patriotic War, it's these huge land battles, and that stuff lives in their military academies and their military educational system. For the Chinese, okay, you have the Civil War, you have a certain understanding of the Korean War. They haven't had a lot of really active wars since then. And now also they're looking out at a kind of war which is really not the one that you associate with the Communist Party, namely airspace and of course naval maritime. And I wonder whether, that the anchoring in history makes any difference. I'll just throw that out to the two of you, and then I will turn to the audience for questions. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Only that, and this is going to sound very trite, but we are, of course, all the sum of the stories we tell ourselves about ourselves. Right. And I would add to your list, right, the Chinese misadventure in Vietnam.
Yep.
Which is a pretty, ought to be a pretty sobering story if you're going to think about your prospects when it comes to military adventurism.
If that's the story they tell themselves.
Well, but the story, I suppose, about the great success of the People's Republic of China in a military sense is the reconstruction of the People's Republic of China as a modern nation state on the borders of the Qing Empire. The last piece, so reabsorbing Tibet, reabsorbing Xinjiang, reabsorbing Inner Mongolia, all of which are military campaigns in the 1950s after the victory in what's called the domestic civil war with the nationalists. There's an inner Asian set of military campaigns which are part of the PLA's heritage. The one outstanding piece of that heritage is, of course, is Taiwan. Yep. So in that sense, history is fundamental. It's at the core of it. And in that sense, even though the war will be waged with satellites and autonomous technologies and all sorts of whiz-bang fantastic bits of kit, if you believe the Chinese propaganda, it is part of a very old struggle that dates back to the success of Mao Zedong and the Chinese Communist Party in the 1950s.
Yeah. Both, by the way, do have science fiction literatures too, which are really interesting.
Yeah.
On these lines. Okay, but enough about us.
Great. I'm going to go ahead and take the first question, and we'll have microphones run around here for the next 15 minutes. But I will take my prerogative for the first question. Simon, and for all three of you, but primarily for Simon, since you brought it up, we've used the term failure of imagination for decades now, and I know I think many of us kind of get a sense of, we know what you mean, and we've used it ourselves. But if you were to describe it more precisely, right? Because we can imagine a lot of things, and a lot of it's not relevant. What are we really trying to imagine? Can you sort of bound what it is that we're trying to do so that we know we're doing the right kind of imagining?
And I can't take the full 15 minutes to answer that, Paul? Okay. I'll take a crack at a 15-second answer to that. The basic answer, and this probably has something to do with my nature at the very least, is that I think the biggest failures of imagination tend to be failures to imagine just how easily things can fail and just how bad things can be. That is the basic area where I think a combination between political exigencies and our preferences not to dwell on the pessimistic steer us away from taking seriously improbable catastrophic outcomes. And I think that is what we have seen time and again. And then the other point that I'll make is one that comes from a lot of the Cold War literature, especially the nuclear literature that you were alluding to, Elliot, which is engaging in mirror imaging. That is to say, failing to imagine the kind of intellectual autonomy of the adversary, and that actually your rationality does not necessarily obtain. The Russian military, the Soviet military before it, always much more comfortable with the idea of the use of nuclear weapons, devolved to a much lower level than their American counterparts. And yet, the mirror imaging activity constantly says, well, of course, they would never do this. There's no way they would do that. When actually, they would talk pretty frequently about doing it.
Tommy, you want to speak to that?
Well, I suppose I've just discussed many people using their imagination and failing to predict the future. So apart from catastrophic contingencies, I suppose at the far end of that spectrum is thermonuclear war, there's like a more quotidian occurrence, which is that wars dissolve into protracted conflicts. Like people tend to predict a decisive engagement, certainly in imaginative fiction. The reality of the First World War, the Second World War, and of the proxy wars which keep the global Cold War hot in the 1950s, 60s, 70s, and 80s are protracted struggles in which societies, as much as the armies that are fielded by those societies, are tested. And that, I think, is something that we should keep in mind as a common failure of imagination, and perhaps something that's unpalatable to take on board, that we need to think about a whole of society response to preparation. The implications of that are risky, they're onerous on civilian populations. Nonetheless, it seems to be the nature of conflict in the Cold War and perhaps in our present Cold War 2.0.
So, and I would say a different kind of failure of imagination, which I think you really see in the United States in particular, is thinking that a war that starts over Taiwan is basically a war that's just about Taiwan.
Sure.
And, World War II in Europe was not a war about Poland. The war in the Pacific was not a war over Pearl Harbor. They started at those places in very dramatic ways, and they're very important, but it would become something very, very different, which would be very scary to imagine, but which is not at all inconceivable. And I think that I am really struck by the way in which at least the kind of public discourse over this is really laser focused on Taiwan to the exclusion of just about everything else.
Well, thank you. So, again, we have microphones going around, and Elliot, if you want to go ahead and call on folks.
Since he's taking me out to dinner, Jeremy.
So one of the things that strikes me is that the Chinese and the Russians have had the chance to watch the American Army fight a lot recently. They've seen what our Army can do, right? They've seen what our Navy can do. They've seen a lot of our capabilities. We haven't seen the PLA fight quite a lot. What can we learn from the Cold War about assessing a military that is large and that appears to have lots of resources but has not fought very much, that we've not seen in action? What mistakes did we make in analyzing the Soviet Union that are mistakes we need to avoid now? What things did we do well in analyzing the Soviet military that we want to make sure we do now in analyzing the PLA?
Guys?
Three quick points. So I think the Chinese and the Russians are smart enough to understand that what they saw in Iraq and Afghanistan has a Venn diagram overlap of what they would be looking at experiencing, especially in some of the more exquisite capabilities, but that there is a lot of experience that they have not actually had the opportunity to bear witness to. And it's actually that stuff that they are rightly the most scared of in terms of sort of mass. The second point, though, and I think this is a really important one, is that the United States military has a lot of combat experience. It does not have a lot of war experience. And this was...
Or battle experience.
Well, this was put very well by a friend of mine who said, for a very long career in special operations, have an enormous quantity of combat under my belt. But then I went back to my very comfortable base, had my Halliburton dinner, worked out in the KKR gym, and watched a movie brought to me by the USO, and fell asleep in my bed with sheets that had been laundered by a bunch of really nice guys from Nepal. And then the next night I went out and we did, 4 hits and rinse, lather, repeat. That is combat. That is not war. And I think that is kind of the big unknown on both sides of the equation. I said I had 3 points, but I really only had 2, Jeremy.
Yeah, I basically endorse that. I think that this is a mirrored problem, and maybe characteristic of, I guess, I'm going to call them long pieces. We're all wrestling with whether or not this is useful to describe our present moment as a Cold War 2.0. It might make sense to call it a long piece 2.0 or 3.0, to piggyback on the work by John Lewis Gaddis. Of course, these long pieces aren't peaceful at all. Like the first long piece involves a tremendous amount of colonial violence the world over. The global Cold War is a hot one, as Arnie Westhead reminds us. And the long piece, insofar as it is peaceful with China, maybe dating back to from the 1970s to the present, if we were to periodize it, it features a whole bunch of combat by the United States military, but very little real war, large-scale, what the U.S. military likes to think of as real war as well, large-scale combat operations that achieve decision on the battlefield. So that's an imponderable that works both ways. We're through the looking glass on both sides of that, I think, and that's something that is that should give us pause, I think.
So I think that core point that the kinds of wars that we've been fighting will be very different from this. I mean, for me, a number of times I remember when I was in government, I'd be flying into El Hadid, where Sarah, I'm sure you've spent a lot of time. And I remember flying over it once and saying, my God, there's 4 B-1s, and there are, I don't know, about 30 F-15s. They're all lined up wingtip to wingtip, bunch of soft structures around them. And I was thinking to myself, I bet you Clark Air Base looked like this in December 7th, 1941. There's an issue for us. Point one. Point two, I think as we look at the Cold War, what is the point where the Soviets, who basically, I think, disdained our World War II performance on the ground, partly rightly, partly wrongly, when did they begin to get alarmed? They begin to get alarmed when they see American technology being joined with operational concepts, so it's air-land battle and assault breaker and all those things, which really began to make them nervous about their ability to fight the kind of war that they anticipated. And I think what happened since the Cold War, which is after all relevant to this, is the Chinese, for sure, and the Russians also, kept on being somewhat surprised by what we could pull off. They were surprised by the way the first Gulf War went down. I think they were somewhat surprised by the second Gulf War. And so I think there's always that fear that the Americans have some kind of, unbelievable bag of technological tricks that they will pull out.
You can see in what they invest in, right? They basically would distill American military doctrine, with apologies to everyone except for the Air Force, as aerospace blitzkrieg. And they invest heavily in trying to counter that type of warfare. They have not, at least in the Russian case, seemed to have made good investments to that end. But again, there too, we have not seen a lot of the Russian capabilities that would come to play in this type of conflict in Ukraine, not at scale.
Yeah. The one other thing I would say is, I think, again, to go back to the net assessment point, one of the things that we learned, or that I was associated with that office since the mid-'80s, that they really found out is you really have to do very fine-grained analysis sometimes to really understand the other side. So, for example, there's a very famous study that was done by General Paul Gorman, who was a remarkable military thinker, on just comparing Soviet and American tank crew training. And what, we assume, well, we're a volunteer military, we're a lot better, our troops are much more versatile. So what the Russians did is, you went in, you were a tank driver, that's all you were going to be. You were just going to be a tank driver for 2 years, or a loader, or a gunner, whatever it is. And they kept the crews together, and so they were actually pretty proficient. We were rotating people around, and so actually our crews were probably less proficient than some of the Soviet tank crews, which that study alone led to a number of changes, at least so I'm told. So, but I think that's an example of some of the kind of really close attention, because otherwise you'll fall back on just sort of rules of thumb or assumption based on things like, well, they don't really have non-commissioned officers, for example, or they don't understand initiative. It always ends up being more complicated than that, I think. Sarah, and then Bob Zellick. You had your hand up first.
So I think I share a lot of Mel's concerns about whether Cold War is the proper analogy, and I think one of concerns that he didn't bring up that I find very central is the issue of essentially what the American public is willing to support at this point. And I think this is central to the question of warfare. So even if you think about the Cold War itself, right? We have always imaginations of what the war could have been, World War III, but the largest kinetic conflict in Vietnam ended up with the collapse of the domestic front of the United States, right? Essentially the failure of domestic mobilization. And that was at a time when you had people who were World War II veterans, people who, the American public by and large bought into the cause of the Cold War, understood what was at stake to a certain degree, and yet, right, the domestic front collapsed in Vietnam. I look at, Ukraine, and it's sort of shocking that the American people can't even, to a large extent, be motivated, right, to support what is a relatively paltry financial amount of military aid to Ukraine, right? A country that's been invaded by Russia. It seems like, as far as the U.S.-China confrontation on the domestic front, it's been sold to the American people as a win-win, right? We confront China, we defend democracy, human rights, we bring the jobs back, our economy prospers, right? But nobody sold to the American people as a sacrifice, right? The Atchison and Truman made a tremendous amount of effort in terms of convincing American people to sacrifice the name of democracy against communism, and the confrontation with China has not been sold to American people as a sacrifice. What are you willing to sacrifice, right, to defeat Chinese authoritarianism, whatever? And I think we're beginning to see some of the backlash against that with the tariffs right now. When you actually have tariffs which cause economic pain, there's backlash against, right, the confrontation with China. So in imagining a war scenario with China going forward in Taiwan, how do you imagine selling this to the American people, just they'd be willing to actually support a war against Taiwan, which, as Ellie Cohen correctly says, right, would probably go way beyond Taiwan. Right? How do you convince the American people to support this kind of war effort?
So, the home front.
I wish I had something optimistic to say. Wasn't it Churchill who sort of said that the United States always does the right thing, but much too late?
After he's exhausted all the other options.
I'm butchering the quote. Honestly, I'm very concerned about this because I think, going back to a point that I made earlier, I do think that the American people fail to see why Taiwan matters and why Ukraine matters, and why eventually you will feel that they matter if you don't deal with them when you are in the phase where you have the luxury of only imagining why they matter. I think the current political climate is trending in a direction that is going to progressively make that harder and harder and harder. And the capitulationist impulses of many people in positions of power are, I think, actually really dangerous, because they are going to, you don't get to avoid some of these conflicts. What all you're doing is just punting on them until they become much, much bigger conflicts.
I don't think it's lost on this question of U.S. Political will for an intervention in defense of Taiwan is one that is a live issue on the island as well. And many authors and writers and military leaders are beginning to speak about the need to come up with an organic theory of victory for Taiwan in the absence of overt U.S. intervention. I mean, the phrase I've heard before is "有感谢." So if we have it, we'll be thankful, but if we don't have it, we won't be afraid to go it alone. And that looks like a kind of asymmetric people-led defense in a protracted engagement against a superior adversary in the form of the PLA. Not so dissimilar to what the communists did to the nationalists in mainland China throughout the 1950s. So that theory is being kicked around in Taiwan, and that realization that the United States might not be willing to expend that political capital is something that I think we can see both from a blue perspective, a red perspective, and from a green perspective.
If I could just put in a kind word for the American people. For me, one of the stunning things about the Biden administration is I don't believe the president gave a single speech about why Ukraine matters. Yeah. And I don't remember any political leader giving a speech about why Taiwan matters. And I don't expect most Americans to think these faraway places are going to matter unless some responsible person gets up and says, yes, it really does matter, and there's something at stake here, and let me tell you about Bucha and Irpin and all the rest. So I think there's a failure of political leadership. And I don't know that, if, God forbid, we end up in a conflict with China, that we get the political leadership that would be able to explain to the American people why it's worth doing this. Mr. Secretary.
Because Roosevelt did that.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
So thanks. Very interesting panel. In the current environment, it may be hard to consider this, but since part of the purpose of the conference is to stretch thinking, I'd be interested in your views about insights from the Cold War period about using arms negotiations as part of regional security. So you touched on it in the nuclear area, which is one obvious one. But at the end of the Cold War was partly driven by a conventional forces negotiation. And if I think about maritime negotiations, particularly in the Western Pacific, there may be insights or lessons to be drawn. And just to give you a further example, I would not at all be surprised that Beijing, over the next year or so, decides to go along with the ASEAN Code of Conduct because they see an opportunity here to outflank us. And they may decide that they can make some friends with ASEAN. Who knows? Maybe even the Philippines taking advantage of the situation. And so I'd like to stretch your thinking a little bit, not so much on the warfare, but on the arms negotiations as part of, again, not just arms for the sake of arms limits, but arms negotiations as part of regional security.
So if I can take an initial crack at that and then turn it over to my colleagues. I think there'll be substantial differences that loom. First, I suspect that there are cultural differences in how the Chinese and how the Soviets will think about this. But one thing that, I was recently rereading Kissinger's memoirs, and one of the things that strikes me is his vivid impression that the Soviets saw arms control negotiations as a way of establishing their equality with the United States. And that so there was a deep psychological compulsion on their side for it. And then, of course, on our side, I mean, a lot of the intellectual groundwork for arms control is done by people like Schelling and others earlier on, which is so based on a certain understanding of how the world works and how you're going to avoid accidental war. So it seems to me that neither of those conditions exist vis-a-vis the Chinese. Now, there may be other reasons that will carry you forward, but I think the intellectual framework on our side and the desire for formal equality on the other side, they just don't strike me as being looming nearly as large as they did during the Cold War. Guys?
Two quick thoughts. I mean, the first is that I think at this point, everyone understands that arms control, nuclear or conventional, and thank you for raising the CFE treaty, because I think it's kind of one of these really great Cold War stories that, in part because it's so sometimes punishingly technical, is not really told. Arms control is a fundamentally competitive endeavor. Right? At the core of arms control is a desire to establish and lock in advantage, in this case in the form of international law, over an adversary. And so I do expect to see, as I think both the Russians and the Chinese reevaluate their circumstances, more activity in that area. And I think the United States has pretty unique advantages, actually, in both of those endeavors. And the second point is just to echo the point about the prestige. And I think we can see how much that status seeking matters to the regime in Beijing. It is very important to how Xi Jinping views his foreign policy goals. And of course, it is going to be, and has historically been, something that Vladimir Putin sees as also cementing his place, because of course it's only the United States and Russia that have kind of civilization extinguishing nuclear capabilities, despite the Chinese buildup. That Vladimir Putin sees this as a powerful tool to make up for his many, many weaknesses, including on the conventional military front.
So I think like one of the lessons of the Cold War here is that because warfare exists on a continuum, so too do arms negotiations, treaties. What you do in SALT has an impact on what you do in your conventional military and so forth. And given that we're on a precipice of revolutions in machine learning, automation, robotics, it's worth thinking maybe prospectively about what arms control agreements might look about with those technologies, because any sorts of exchanges or diplomatic or international law conventions that we arrive at with the PRC are likely to have ramifications felt across these new and emerging domains, and we should think proactively about those implications and ramifications, because they will be unpredictable.
I was worried you were going to say we're on the precipice of a revolution in military affairs. No. I was going to leave.
No.
And I just got the hand across the
Thanks so
throat.
much to our first panel.
Thanks.
Hey, thank you so much. It's a pleasure to meet you, sir.